authorities in fields like nuclear terror, bioterror, pandemic. I'm talking about just leading authorities in the world, not necessarily people in our church, not necessarily Christians. What would happen if we talked to them about what they see coming? What would they tell us? And so I started doing my research and I started making my list. And I decided, why not start with the top? the biggest experts in the world, at least the most noteworthy experts in the United States. And I figured what will probably happen is they'll turn me down because, you know, who are we? But maybe they'll refer me to someone who I'll get a good interview with. And I started with a gentleman, well, I won't name him, but anyway, someone who you've probably seen in the news, someone when there was a pandemic outbreak, when the swine flu virus came out a couple years ago, he was in the news. He's really probably the leading authority on bioterror and pandemic in this nation. And as I tried to schedule an interview with him, I could see that I was in for some real challenges. Naturally, you know, he wanted to vet me. He wanted to know about me and who I was and what I was about. And I was somewhat concerned about how much information I wanted to start sharing with these people, such as, you know, where I live and all of that. I mean, I have a family, and this was early in the stages of the game, and as time went on, I figured, well, pretty soon, you know, it doesn't matter anymore. I mean, but I was cautious, and so we couldn't schedule that interview. We couldn't get around the hurdles. But I kept working at it, and finally started to get some bites when I would send an email. It took a lot of persistence. Eventually, we got that gentleman as well, and this ultimately became the project called America Cities. Very, very interesting, as I had the privilege of speaking with really the top authorities in some of these fields. As we started to look at the raw footage before we started to do the edit, I made some decisions about this film from the very beginning. First, I decided I wanted to interview people who would generally be accepted as credible. And I knew that doing that meant that I wouldn't get as much hype out the other end, because they're going to be guarded. They're going to be very cautious because of their particular status in the security community and all of that. But I made that decision early. I knew there were certain people I could talk to who would give me a fabulous interview, but some would question their credibility. So I made that decision early on. But what was remarkable as we started to look at the raw footage, I discovered something amazing. It was something that I had hoped would happen. I have a brother who's actually in the film industry, and he told me, Dave, if you're going to do a documentary, you have to be honest. You have to be willing to go where it takes you. You may have an idea in mind, but you have to have integrity that will go where it takes you. You can't force it. And I thought, fair enough. But where it took us was pretty amazing. Time and time again, as you listen to these authorities talk, it led to the same conclusion, that pretty much across the board, cities are not a place to be in a disaster. They all, not only did we get consensus from most of them on that question, but two of the people that we interviewed, one of the people that we interviewed was a former associate director of FEMA at the national level, and we interviewed him in his mountain retreat home. Very, very interesting project. The film, by the way, I decided not to narrate the film because narration is a great way to give it your own inflection, and I really wanted a piece that would have the integrity of what these people say without me interposing my view over the top of it. And so you can actually see the film trailer at americascitiesthemovie.com. At this point, I'm pretty happy to say that the film has gone into a lot of different hands. We had hoped that we would reach, my idea was that this could be a tool to share with not just non-Adventists, but even non-Christians. And the way we decided to bring the spiritual element in is that after doing these interviews, we end up with an interview of a family about how they have decided to respond to these challenges. And it just so happens that the family is a Seventh-day Adventist family. So still, without narration, without me superimposing anything over the top of the film, we're able to just strictly with interviews and sound bites put together, able to deliver a message. The reason I'm telling you the story about this film is that in the process of doing the film, I also interviewed some Adventist pastors and some people in faith ministries within the Adventist community. Ultimately, we decided not to use that footage in this particular film, but I want to tell you about something that was very interesting to me. I discovered that if I would ask a Seventh-day Adventist pastor if the Out of the Cities message is in the Bible, that, what shall I say, as likely as not, I would get an answer that was either no, it's not in the Bible, or, well, not really directly. And that was very interesting to me because I think differently, but I didn't want to coach the people that I was interviewing. I think it's a valid question to ask ourselves. Is the Out of the Cities message in the Bible? Is there a biblical imperative? Is the concept even there that there would come a time when God's people should get out of the city? And if so, where is that message? Because look, if this message is only in the spirit of prophecy, then that creates some challenges for us in sharing this warning message with the world. Now, I use material from the spirit of prophecy when I talk to non-Adventists. I'm just saying that, even she herself said that we should establish our positions on the Bible without the use of her writings when we're doing evangelism, for example. You know that, right? By the same token, I don't mind quoting from her. We've done health seminars. My wife and I have done health seminars together where we've used her writings freely. I don't mind doing that. But I want to be able to establish the foundation for why I teach what I teach from the Bible. So I have good news for you tonight, and it's there. And I want to show that to you, and then we're going to drill a little bit deeper and see what unique perspective we as Adventists have. So I'd like to pause for prayer right now and ask the Lord to be with us in this study as we open His Word. If you'd bow your heads with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for this wonderful Sabbath that we've had together, and here we are still meeting. The sun has gone down. We're entering a new week. We thank you for the blessings of the Sabbath, and we ask that you would be with us and bless us in this new week and help us to be in tune with your Holy Spirit. And I pray tonight you'd help me to be in tune. Help me not to stand in the way of the message for which I long for there to be clarity in all of our minds. And so please bless to that end, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's take a look at where I believe we find the Out of the Cities message in the Bible. And Bliss talked about it a few minutes ago. We've talked about it before. Ben made reference to this as well. In Genesis chapter 19, we find the story of Lot. And in Luke 17, Jesus tells us that the experience of Lot and his family and the whole story surrounding the destruction of Sodom is a parallel to world events at the end and serves as an illustrative example of how we should respond to what's happening at the end. So we talked about this a little bit in our first session too, that as much as I think it would be so neat to see Lot and his family tiptoeing out over the crispy ruins, that wasn't the plan. If we're going to take a lesson from the story, the obvious lesson is get out of the way, get out of the city. So certainly we find it there. In fact, there are predominantly 3 cities in the Bible given to us as illustrations of God's plan at the end of time. And in each of those cases, we find this parallel concept. In Matthew chapter 24, we find, of course, this is the chapter in the book of Matthew that has signs of the end, right? Incidentally, that chapter is also, there's a unique understanding that we bring to the table that there's a dual application of Matthew 24, right? One for the destruction of Jerusalem and an application for the end of the world. That's important. And so, to me, it's very interesting. In fact, I missed this for a long time, even when I was preaching on the abomination of desolation in Matthew chapter 24. I missed this. You know, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. And what I missed was that here in the chapter that deals with the last days, the closing events of Earth's history, and the second coming of Christ, is a story about people who had to get out of a city. Isn't that interesting? I mean, let's just keep it simple. That right there in the description of signs of the end and the trouble coming upon the world is a story of God's people. They need to get out of Jerusalem. And yet we understand that Matthew 24 is talking about signs of the end, but do you catch the significance of that story tucked right there? If you don't catch the significance, then I want to suggest, chew on that. Think about that. Okay, so you've got the story of the destruction of Jerusalem and the need for God's people to get out of that city. And then we talked about Revelation 18. Babylon has fallen, and what's the appeal? Come out of her, my people. I got to tell you, as I was interviewing different people in ministry in the Adventist community, my eyes, I told you, I didn't load their gun, I didn't coach them, I didn't cue them. I just wanted to see what would happen if I asked these people, is the out of the city's message in the Bible? And you can imagine that my eyes just lit up one evening as I was interviewing someone. I asked him, is it in the Bible? And he looked back and he didn't miss a beat. He fired right back at me. Babylon has fallen, come out of her, my people. And it was just like, finally. Now that's not an isolated case. And let me remind you, I read this earlier, but let me read it again because I don't want to take away from the spiritual application of Babylon and the symbolic sense in prophecy. I'm not removing a thread of that. But I do want to add, if you haven't already had this in your thinking, I want to add this layer of a literal application in terms of what's going to happen in the cities in relationship to what the Bible says about Babylon. So again, we'll read this a second time here. Manuscript Releases, volume 21, 91. Let all who would understand the meaning of these things read the 11th chapter of Revelation, read every verse, and learn the things that are yet to take place in the cities. Read also the scenes portrayed in the 18th chapter of the same book. And we talked about Revelation 11 and the cities of Sodom and Egypt. We talked about Revelation 18, the city of Babylon. And Mrs. White is saying, learn the things that are yet to take place in the cities. There's a literal application. So most definitely, it's there. But now let's push this into a sharper focus. Because I'm assuming that you're with me on this idea that in the last days this becomes a more urgent issue. That in the stream of time, this hasn't necessarily been. In fact, we're going to read some statements where Mrs. White said, the time would come. So it hasn't always been such a high priority matter or even something that necessarily had to be on the list. Why now? Or, better question, how do we know when? When is the time? In Adventist circles, I find that seems to be argued more than whether or not we should get out, it's when. And there are plenty of voices now saying, not yet. And I want to chime in and add my voice to those who are saying, we're running out of time to do it. Now, to the question of when, I first want to look at this in a broad sort of just the principle of it, because I think that's the most valuable to us. That'll set a foundation we can build on. So in Matthew chapter 24, in verses 15 and 16, it talks about this abomination of desolation. If you compare that to Luke chapter 21, parallel passage, there we find Jesus stating that what that would look like, what that abomination of desolation standing in the holy place would look like, could also be described as the Roman armies surrounding the city of Jerusalem. You remember that? That's in Luke 21, I think 20 or 21. So when the Roman armies would surround Jerusalem, that would be the sign. Now, here's the question. What would the application be to our day? Now, in a few minutes, I want to actually I want to work with the advantage that we have as Seventh-day Adventists, what we can bring to the table to bring this into really sharp focus. But how would you share this? Could you share this concept? Could you share the Out of the Cities message and the timeliness of it now to someone who doesn't know about Ellen White and who's not yet in a position to embrace her authority? Could you do it? I want to suggest you can, and here's how. Because when the Roman armies surrounded Jerusalem, if you think about it in a broader sense, when they planted those standards in the holy ground around the walls of the city, they were signifying that they're going to take the city. That was a threat to the liberties of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, right? They didn't actually take the city initially, and we're going to talk about this more. There were two sieges. First siege, they didn't actually take the city. It was a threat to their liberties. And right there lies the key to understanding the principle for the timing to get out, especially if you live in the United States of America. Now, we could point way back, and we will look back in a few minutes with the advantage of the lens of the Spirit of prophecy to see this happening even a long time ago. But most of you sitting in this room have been alive to see the greatest threats and the greatest attack against the liberties of our nation ever in its history. And of course, I'm talking about the developments that we've seen, especially since 9/11. And maybe in its most sharp, rude form was the Patriot Act. And some people will now say, well, but you know, a lot of the Patriot Act maybe passed off the scene. Not all of it. But there has been other things that have followed in its train, like FISA, which gives the government the right to spy on you without your knowledge, without your consent, for up to, I think it's a week or 2 weeks or something like that. This is just one example. There has been an incredible assault against the liberties which our Constitution guarantees to us in the last decade like we've never seen before. So I'm pointing that out because you and I live at a unique advantage or vantage point where when we talk about liberties being threatened, all kinds of bells should go off for us. And that is really, in the broadest sense, that was the meaning of the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem. It's more than that, but still I'm trying to talk about this in a way that we could actually share this with other people who aren't yet at a point in their understanding, because where I'm going to go with you now, if you haven't been down this path before with me, as we talk about the unique perspective and the development of the Sunday law and the National Sunday Law, which is developments that have already happened in the past. This is a huge silo full of hay to dump on someone's plate if they don't have all the structure and the trappings to be able to digest that. And so we need to have a way to share things with people initially. And I really believe that this is one of the best ways, is to talk about this. And I also believe that's why we're seeing people who aren't Seventh-day Adventists, some who aren't even Christians, who are getting out of the city now. Because they see what's happening. They recognize that our liberties are being threatened. They see the direction of things, and it's interesting that they have been able to work through the equation, and out the other end comes the answer, get out of the city. Isn't that interesting? Without all of the additional light that we have, and it seems like we have a harder time figuring it out. Why is that? Let's go ahead now and let's drill deeper. Let's look at a statement that's going to help us to do that. It's talking about the sign. It's talking about that siege around Jerusalem. But if some of you have heard me on my presentation that used to be called the Abomination of Desolation, and then we called it Out of the Cities, this is a little different approach tonight. We're actually going to tear this statement apart, piece by piece, phrase by phrase, and I'm hoping that's going to be helpful as we seek to understand this. Because this quotation I'm going to put up now is a quotation that has been used more than any other to neutralize the Out of the Cities message. And so, you know, a pastor friend of mine called me a few years ago and said, Dave, why don't you just stop preaching about this? Just talk about country living, but don't talk about this quote. And I said, well, it's not fair to do that because people are misusing this quote. And so I feel like it's only fair to at least raise my voice and say, let me at least give another perspective. So I hope you understand where I'm coming from tonight. I'm not trying to say I've got all the answers, okay? But I want to offer you at least another perspective on how to look at this passage. And I'm not going to suggest it's the only perspective. I am going to suggest I think it's a pretty good perspective. So let's go through it together. Here's the statement from Testimonies, Volume 5, 464 and 465. As the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was the signal for flight to the Judean Christians, so the assumption of power on the part of our nation in the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us. It will then be time to leave the large cities, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes and secluded places among the mountains. Now, you can see right away why this statement has been used to at least give people pause about leaving the city, because they say, well, the Sunday law hasn't been passed yet. And I'm not going to try and squeak around anything or encourage anyone to miss any part of this quote. I'm going to go back, and you can see why, because of this phrase right here. The assumption of power on the part of our nation in the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us. Okay? The question is, does that mean that the National Sunday Law must be passed for that sign to be fulfilled? Well, okay, okay, good point. I'm glad you brought that up. But I'm going to challenge that response, okay? And I'm not in a hostile way or anything, but Sunday laws that are on the books, we're talking about state legislation. And it's clear that what Mrs. White was talking about was federal, was national, okay? So I'm not trying to make light or make less of those Sunday laws, okay? Understand me, but I'm willing to go ahead and tackle this as a national Sunday law issue. I think it's important that we do that, okay? Now, before you answer, must the National Sunday Law be passed for this to sign? Is that really what she's talking about? Did she mean by these words that the National Sunday Law must be passed? That's the question. Now, rather than us, first of all, try to jump through any hoops or anything like that to answer the question, I wonder if she would answer the question herself. Would she tell us what she means? Well, guess what? Let's take a look at a number of statements. Starting in 1902, we could start earlier than that, and there are others that start earlier, but I'm going to start there. Said the messenger of God, shall not the cities be warned? Yes, not by God's people living in them. Well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? But by their visiting them to warn them of what is coming upon the earth. Okay, here's another one. Again and again, the Lord has instructed that our people are to take their families away from the cities into the country. I read this actually earlier. It also appears in Adventist Home, page 141, where it talks about the importance of raising your own food. I'm going to skip that part and go right down to here. We should now begin to heed the instruction given us over and over again, get out of the cities. Well, that seemed pretty clear, isn't it? That's 1904. Here's 1905. Let children no longer be exposed to the temptations of the cities that are ripe for destruction. The Lord has sent us warning and counsel to get out of the cities. Then let us make no more investments in the cities. Fathers and mothers, how do you regard the souls of your children? Are you preparing the members of your families for translation into the heavenly courts? Are you preparing them to become members of the royal family, children of the heavenly King? What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? How will ease, comfort, convenience compare with the value of the souls of your children? 1905. Let's go on. Here's another one. 1906. I'm sure you've seen this before. Out of the cities, out of the cities. This is the message the Lord has been giving me. The earthquakes will come, the floods will come, and we are not to establish ourselves in the wicked cities where the enemy is served in every way and where God is so often forgotten. Here's another one. The instruction is still being given, move out of the cities, 1907. Here's one, 1908. Who will be warned, we say again, out of the cities? So now let's ask that question I asked a few minutes ago. When she said the assumption of power on the part of our nation and the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath will be a warning to us, was she saying that the National Sunday Law must be passed before we have the sign to get out? Let me answer it this way. I think it's important that we walk through it like this, because this is what people are suggesting. To suggest that what Mrs. White meant was that the sign to go is after the Sunday Law and not before would be to suggest that she's totally confused. Because I just read you a whole bunch of statements, and there are others I could have read, where she said, get out of the cities. It's time. To suggest that that statement in Testimonies Volume 5 doesn't really mean get out of the cities. What it really means is wait for the Sunday Law. It's confusion. So if we can't figure out anything else, we should recognize right there, there's a problem. Okay? Well, I don't believe she was confused about this. But we need to follow a principle of understanding. By the way, are there ever times in the Bible where a statement or a scripture could be used to make a case on the wrong side of something if you don't include everything else that the Bible says? Can you give me an example? Pardon? Colossians 2:17? About the Sabbath? Okay, you mentioned something nailed to the cross. Okay. What else? Look, here's a great one. Today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Hey, I got a verse for it. Right? Are there ever some challenging passages? Yes. But one thing that I hope you've embraced, because it served me well, and it served you well as Seventh-day Adventists sitting here today, it served Adventism well, is that one thing you never do is you never throw out a mountain of very clear, inspired counsel, instruction, because of one statement that you seem to understand a certain way. To throw out a mountain of clear statements for one that doesn't seem to fit is a bad move. When you have a lot of statements that seem to be very clear, and there's another one that seems to be out over here, what do? You go back and you look at it in the light of everything else and see, is it possible that I'm misunderstanding this one, that I need to look at it differently so that it will line up with everything else? Listen, Adventism was built on that approach to interpretation of the Scriptures, right? We line them up. And some people don't like that, you know. It's just, why are you always proof texting? That's why. Because if you try to build something on one statement, you can build all kinds of things. Okay? So, can we take a look at this? I want to take this phrase by phrase, this statement from Testimonies Volume 5. And I'm asking a question. Is there an understanding of this statement that would allow me to keep all the other statements on the table too, to keep everything on the table? Okay? So let's go through it. We're going to follow this. By the way, I think this is an interesting statement. No, what I'm talking about, the approach to Scripture interpretation, I just was waxing on about, we sometimes refer to that as line upon line, right? Precept upon precept, Isaiah 8:20. And Mrs. White said we should do the same thing with her writings. Did you know that? The testimonies themselves will be the key that will explain the messages given as Scripture is explained by Scripture. So what did she say? If you don't understand something I said, if it doesn't seem to work, look for everything else I said and put it all together. It's a safety. Put it together. Okay? So let's do that. Let's take it phrase by phrase. The first phrase, as the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman armies was the signal for flight to the Judean Christians. Now this is interesting. I alluded to this story. I'll say a little bit more about it right now. And in Luke 21, verses 20 and 21, it says this, "When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains." So there's the sign for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And it's interesting, Mrs. White said that's supposed to be a parallel for us to understand the timing at the end. Now we've already talked about it in a broad sense, the threat of liberties. But now and I'm thankful for the advantage of the lens of the spirit of prophecy, aren't you? That allows us to drill deeper. It allows us to go into sharper focus on things. And so let's do that. But before we do, let's remind ourselves the parallel passage to Luke 21, 20 and 21 is Matthew 24, 15 and 16, where it says this, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." So we're talking about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place is something Jesus also described as the Roman armies surrounding the city of Jerusalem. Now, this was described by Mrs. White in the book Great Controversy on page 26. "When the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up in the holy ground, which extended some furlongs outside the city walls, then the followers of Christ were to find safety in flight." So you see, when the Roman armies came, they had these standards that they were signs that had Roman deity on them, and they planted them in the holy ground. Now, the holy ground was an area that extended beyond the city walls. And not to be confused, some people get this confused with the holy place of the temple. No, this is the holy ground which extended out beyond the walls of the city of Jerusalem. And the Romans knew about that, and so they planted emblems of their deity, their false gods, right there in that area. It was a threat, it was an affront, and it was a statement of their intentions. And we're told that when that happened, that was the sign. Christ's followers inside would see it and they would recognize that that was the sign. Well, this is where, and Mrs. White gets into this in the first chapter of Great Controversy. So if you want to understand this better, just read that chapter. It's an interesting story. And many people aren't aware that there were actually 2 sieges. This happened twice. The sign to get out of the city came in AD 66 with a general named Cestius, Roman general Cestius. And what we read is exactly what happened. The Roman standards were planted in the holy ground. So Christ's followers in the city saw this is our sign, but now they have a problem. We can't get out because the city's surrounded, right? Well, one day, for no apparent reason, at least to the people in Jerusalem, the Roman armies took off. They left. And of course, Christ's followers recognized this is their opportunity. The interesting thing is that the Jewish armies chased after the Roman armies and almost routed them in battle, which unfortunately made them all the more brazen and bold later and unwilling to give in, to surrender. But anyway, as those armies Roman armies first coming in, sweeping the countryside, and then the battles, the skirmishes that followed as the Jewish armies chased them out, this really kind of opened up the area for the Christians to get out. And they went to a little city in the mountains. The little city's name was Pella. Kind of interesting, huh? From a big city to a little city. We see that pattern again. It's interesting how these patterns play out. So that happened in AD 66. Well, I haven't been able to put my finger right on the dates. Someone just told me you did a book on the abomination of desolation, and maybe you've been able to nail the date down. But it appears to me it's approximately 3.5 years later, but I haven't been able to nail it down to exactly 3.5 years. Maybe that's not important, but I'm just that kind of guy. I'm looking for, okay? Approximately 3.5 years. The Roman armies come back. but this time under a different general, Titus. And now, what's happened? Well, you can read the description in Great Controversy. When the Roman armies came back, because of a lot of fighting and some famine and all of that, the food sources had been depleted in the city, and they were nowhere near being prepared for another siege. And so what followed is just horrible, and you can read the descriptions in the first chapter of the book, Great Controversy. It's just such an intriguing story then of how the soldiers of the Roman army they see what's happening, and they actually want to put a stop to it. They want to put a stop to what's going on inside, and they're practically begging Titus to let them go in and take the city. And finally he says, okay, but don't hurt the temple. I mean, it's like one of the wonders of the world here. Save the temple. And essentially what happens is when his men entered the city at that time, he lost control of his own men. They, took into serious fighting inside the city. You can read about how Jews fled to the temple for safety, and Josephus says that blood flowed like water down the steps of the temple. And then in the book Great Controversy, in that first chapter, you can read this intriguing account of this soldier who goes into the temple, and he's just in awe. And he's got that firebrand, and it's just like he just can't hold back. He just can't help himself. And he throws that flaming spear in, and soon the whole temple is lit ablaze. And she describes the white faces on the wall and the sounds of the screams and the moans and the thousands of people that lost their lives. And then she says this, not one Christian perished. And she quickly adds, because they saw the sign. They left the city. So that's our rule. That's the parallel that Mrs. White points us to. And she's drawing some kind of a parallel, obviously, about the Sunday law, but what? How do we bring that together? Well, let's keep going. Because we have to ask ourselves the question, if there's a modern-day parallel, then we should look for a modern-day Rome, right? Because that was pagan Rome I'm talking about, so I'm dealing with a bunch of advanced Adventist prophecy scholars here, right? So pagan Rome handed the scepter of power to papal Rome. And the activities of papal Rome are described in Revelation 13, beginning of the chapter there, first part, as this seven-headed beast. But what's interesting is, what would be the sign? What would be the standard? What would be the standard? The Roman armies, the pagan Roman armies, had their standards that they planted. So what would be the standard in modern times? Now, this is interesting to me. I don't recommend that we, try to do our prophecy learning from Rome, okay? But it's interesting to me that they themselves will tell the answer. I just find that interesting. It's like, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You don't have to, be a master in biblical languages. Even this power, described as that seven-headed beast in Revelation 13, they will tell you. They will tell you what it is. So let's read it from their own sources. Of course, the Catholic Church claims that the change, talking about the change of the Sabbath, was her act. And the act is a mark of her ecclesiastical power and authority in religious matters. Isn't that interesting? I mean, they're willing to say what the mark is, what that sign. By the way, sign, standard, mark, these words can be used interchangeably. Okay, here's another example. Sunday is our mark of authority. The church is above the Bible, and this transference of Sabbath observance is proof of that fact. Catholic Record, September 1, 1923. But the interesting thing is that in Revelation 13, this power is not acting alone, right? There's an interesting alliance formed with another power, and that's that second beast of Revelation 13, which is being described here. I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. Now, which world power is that referring to? United States. Okay? And we're not going to go, if this is new to anybody here, you can talk to me or talk to Bliss or, one of the elders here, whatever. We can get more information in your hands and we can study with you. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because I'm pressing forward to make another point. So let's go back now to the description of the siege of Jerusalem, that first siege, and the sign, the standards. And I want you to notice the language, and we're going to see something very interesting here. Again, Great Controversy, page 26. When the idolatrous standards of the Romans should be set up in the holy ground. Now I want you to notice, idolatrous standards set up in the holy ground, which extended some furlongs outside the city walls, then the followers of Christ were to find safety in flight. Now, has modern Rome, or this alliance, done anything for which the same kind of language could be used? Idolatrous standards being set up. What do you think? Well, I expect you to say yes. But rather than getting your word for it, or my word for it, maybe we should ask Mrs. White. Would she use that same language to describe anything else that's happened? This is really interesting. Look at this. This was in 1897. That's a long time ago. The Protestant world have set up an idol Sabbath. Do you think that's just coincidental, that language? Set up an idol Sabbath. Let me back up. Idolatrous standards set up. Protestant world has set up an idol Sabbath in the place where God's Sabbath should be, and they are treading in the footsteps of the papacy. Now look at what she wrote next. For this reason, I see the necessity of the people of God moving out of the cities into retired country places. Is that amazing? Identical language. Now I recognize that's a long time ago. That's 1897. The question is, what was she talking about? I mean, you realize this could be the key that unlocks the trouble that we otherwise would have with that statement in Testimonies Volume 5 that we're working on. So let's keep going. We're going to find out. Let's keep going on that statement. Let's go to the next phrase. So, the assumption of power on the part of our nation. Let's stop right there. Let's take it phrase by phrase. The assumption of power. Now, what does that mean? Well, why don't we let her tell us what it means? We're trying to follow that rule. You know, you let the Bible explain the Bible, you let Mrs. White explain Mrs. White. What does she mean by that? It turns out she's used very similar or the same language in other places. So let's see what she says, how she uses it. There must be no assumption of power. There it is. On the part of God's chosen people. Those who take their orders from Christ must not seek to compel others to obey the law of Jehovah. So what does it mean to assume power? It means to seek to compel others. In this context, she's even talking about seeking to compel others to do what's right. Isn't that interesting? But still, she's saying that's an assumption of power. To seek to compel someone to do something is an assumption of power. Notice, we'll use another example here from her writings. The Creator has, with His own authority, given you His Sabbath to observe, and yet human agencies will attempt to set aside the seventh-day Sabbath, which commemorates God's holy work of creating the world in 6 working days and resting on the 7th day. How can men dare assume the authority? There it is again. Of Jehovah. Now it's similar language. It doesn't say power, it says authority. Same kind of context. Assume the authority of Jehovah and represent themselves as God to change times and laws. So to seek to compel someone to do something, even if it's right, or to dare to represent themselves as God to change times and laws, these are assumptions of power. Okay? Here's another one. This is really interesting. So it will be again, but it is over the 7th-day Sabbath that the battle will be fought. The authorities of this world will rise up in their pride and power to make laws to restrict religious liberty. They will, notice the language, assume a right that is God's alone, and like Nebuchadnezzar, will think that they can force the conscience which only God can control. Now notice the next phrase. Even now they are making a beginning. Do you catch that? Whatever she's talking about, she's saying that it was present tense in her day that an assumption of power, an assumption of authority was taking place. A beginning is being made. By the way, this takes us back to our first presentation. These sweeping developments at the end, how do they happen? Are they punctiliar? Are they a point in time? We saw again and again they're a process. And so why wouldn't we expect that this same thing, this assumption of power, would start even before it might even be recognized by many people as so? It starts small and it grows. And she said a beginning is already taking place. And this they will carry forward till they reach a boundary over which they cannot step. Then God will interpose in behalf of his loyal commandment-keeping people. Remarkable. December 20, 1898, Review and Herald. All right, next phrase. The decree enforcing the papal Sabbath. Well, you say that's pretty straightforward. Why do we have to define that? Well, because so many people think that that has to be when the National Sunday Law is passed. Did she ever use this phrase in present tense before the National Sunday Law is passed? Let's see. In the very time in which we live, the Lord has called his people and has given them a message to bear. He has called them to expose the wickedness of the man of sin who has made the Sunday Law. What Sunday Law? Had the Sunday Law passed yet? No, but she called it a Sunday Law. A distinctive power who has thought to change times and laws and to oppress the people of God, who stand firmly to honor him by keeping the only true Sabbath, the Sabbath of creation, as holy unto the Lord. Testimonies to Ministers, page 118. Here's another one. Counsels to Writers and Editors, 98. We should now be doing our very best to defeat this Sunday law. The best way to do this will be to lift up the law of God. Make it stand forth in all its sacredness. This must be done if the truth triumphs. She used the phrase Sunday law before there was a national Sunday law passed. She used it. Here's another one. The decree enforcing the worship of this day is to go forth to all the world. In a limited degree, it has already gone forth. Wow. The decree? In a limited degree. See, that shouldn't surprise us now, because we know the pattern. It starts small and it grows. It starts in a limited way. The first siege was only a siege, and then a retreat. But when the Roman armies came back the second time, it was with fury. In several places, the civil power is speaking with the voice of a dragon. By the way, that's language that is used to refer to legislative actions in the United States, right? I mean, that's from Revelation 13. Just as the heathen king spoke to the Hebrew captives. All right. So far, we're seeing that there was an application in her day, and we'll get to it in a moment. The next phrase, it'll be a warning to us. The assumption of power. This decree, it would be a warning to us. Now, all I want to do with this phrase is, we should know the answer already because of the statements I read at the beginning. But did she already make clear that the warning had come to get out of the cities? She did time and time again. But let's be real precise, okay? Let's be real precise. Look at these statements. Sorry the text is so small. I wanted to fit the whole thing onto one slide. Patriarchs and Prophets 166. Before the destruction of Sodom, God sent a message to Lot. Escape for thy life. Look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest thou be consumed. The same voice of warning, okay, now we're talking about warning. That's the phrase we're looking at. It will be a warning to us. The same voice of warning was heard by the disciples of Christ before the destruction of Jerusalem. And then she quotes Luke 21, what we've read already. They must not tarry to secure anything from their possessions, but must make the most of opportunity to escape. There was a coming out, a decided separation from the wicked, an escape for life. So it was in the days of Noah, so with Lot, so with the disciples prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, and so it will be in the last days. And now notice, she writes in present tense. Again, the voice of God is heard in a message of warning, bidding his people separate themselves from the prevailing iniquity. Here's another one, even sharper. December 11, 1900, Review and Herald. I could not sleep past 2 o'clock this morning. During the night season, I was in council. I was pleading with some families to avail themselves of God's appointed means and get away from the cities to save their children. Some were loitering, making no determined efforts. The angels of mercy hurried Lot and his wife and daughters by taking hold of their hands. Had Lot hastened as the Lord desired him to, his wife would not have become a pillar of salt. Lot had too much of a lingering spirit. Let us not be like him. And I asked the question. She said that that sign would be a warning to us. Is it time for the warning now? Notice what she goes on to say. The same voice that warned Lot to leave Sodom bids us, present tense, Come out from among them and be ye separate and touch not the unclean. Those who obey this warning will find a refuge. Let every man be wide awake for himself and try to save his family. Let him gird himself for the work. God will reveal from point to point what to do next. You know, that's a great promise, isn't it? It's not just a warning, it's a promise that God will be with you, that God will help you. Man, I wonder sometimes, is anybody losing sleep over this issue? She was losing sleep. I could not sleep past 2 o'clock because she was so distraught about families that were not making determined efforts. And listen, we should be clear about this. She's talking about loitering. It takes time to get out of the city. That's why people who think they're going to wait are really mistaken. It's a process, just like everything else we've been talking about tonight. It's a process. It takes time. She was talking about people who are loitering. They're not even starting the process. If nothing else, when you leave here from this meeting tonight, the next meeting, start the process, man. Get started. Don't loiter. All right, it will then be time. I'm going phrase by phrase. It would be a warning to us. It will then be time. And you know what comes next? To leave the large cities. The question is, because people have tried to make this statement that we're taking sort of bone by bone, piece by piece, people have tried to make it say, not yet. This is a simple question. She says it would then be time to leave the large cities. Did she ever say it was time? Well, we read a bunch of statements, but let's be sharply focused. We're doing almost like, word comparison here. Did she say the time has come? Notice this. The time has come. When? As God opens the way. Doesn't that sound like that siege around Jerusalem? Backing off, the way is open so the people can leave. The time has come when, as God opens the way, families should move out of the cities. The children should be taken into the country. The time has come. That was in 1903. Now, let's take another look at this. The Protestant world have set up an idol Sabbath in the place where God's Sabbath should be. They're treading in the footsteps of the papacy. For this reason, I see the necessity of the people of God moving out of the cities into retired country places. When was that? 1897. Now, we read it before, but what I'm trying to do now is let's try to get our focus. What was she talking about? Whatever it was, it happened before 1903. There's another statement I'll read in a while, 1900, get out of the large cities as fast as possible. And that's the first thing you're supposed to do when you see the sign, right? According to Testimonies, Volume 5. Had to be before that. And now we see it's got to be before 1897. Whatever it was she saw happen before 1897, what was it? This is really interesting. So let me take you back to the year 1888. Most Adventists know about 1888 because of what? Jones and Wagner, Minneapolis. The General Conference session, the delivery of the message of righteousness by faith to God's people. But it's interesting, most people don't know that at the end of that General Conference session, there was a critical meeting among church leaders because there was a serious development afoot in our nation's capital. Senator H.W. Blair from New Hampshire had introduced what is now called the Blair Bill. If passed, it would result in a national Sunday law. And church leaders were very concerned. So get this in your head. This is at the end of the General Conference session in Minneapolis. Church leaders decided to send A.T. Jones to our nation's capital to fight the passing of that bill. And he went. The hearings for the Blair Bill were in December of 1888. One of the largest organizations, maybe the largest organization, backing this movement, backing the Blair Bill and the idea of a Sunday law, was an organization referred to as the NRA. Have you heard of them? But it was different. It's not the National Rifle Association. It was the National Reform Association. Sometimes when Mrs. White talked about this, she would refer to it as the National Reform Movement. But here's the point. How significant was the Blair Bill. See, the problem is, in the passing of time, and now we're years downstream, and most Seventh-day Adventists don't even know there was a Blair Bill. They don't even know what it was. A pastor, a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, in having a discussion with me about this, referred to the Blair Bill as the abortive Blair Bill. Why? Because the Blair Bill ultimately didn't pass. I think we should be really careful minimizing the importance of the Blair Bill. Why? Because of what I'm going to read to you right now. Keep in mind, the hearings of the Blair Bill, December of 1888. January 1, 1889, days later, in the review, we find this statement published from Mrs. White. We must show to the world that we recognize in the events that are now taking place in connection with the national reform movement. Remember, I told you about them. She's talking about the Blair Bill discussions. We must show to the world that we recognize in the events that are now taking place in connection with the reform movement, national reform movement, the what? Fulfillment of prophecy. Is that something we want to minimize? Is that something we want to sweep under the rug? Oh, that's just that little abortive Blair Bill, no big deal. Are you kidding? She says it's the fulfillment of prophecy. Notice she goes on, that which we have for the last 30 or 40 years proclaimed would come is now here. And the trumpet of every watchman upon the walls of Zion should raise the alarm. When I read this, it really disturbed me because I thought, wait a minute, we were told that we're supposed to tell the world what this means. And we don't even know what it means. You with me? I mean, this is amazing. Well, as I already said, A.T. Jones went, A.T. Jones fought the passage of that bill, it did not pass. So, business as usual, right? Wait a minute, what's our parallel? 2 sieges. Uh-oh. First siege was the sign. There's another siege coming. Could there be? On our website, backtooenoch.org, if you go to resources and I think articles, publications, something like that, I've got a letter there. A friend of mine subscribes to the Lord's Day Alliance magazine. Have you ever heard of the Lord's Day Alliance? Yeah. Do you know that they had a different name years ago? I don't remember now what the name used to be. It wasn't the National Reform Association. It was a different name. That other organization or that other name was with the National Reform Association in pushing the Blair Bill. After 9/11, my friend who subscribes to the Lord's Day Alliance magazine received a copy. He received a letter. It was actually a letter from the then director of the Lord's Day Alliance. I think it was an appeal for funds. So it came late in 2001. And a copy of that letter is on our website. So I got that from my friend who got it right from the Lord's Day Alliance in the mail. In the letter, the director of Lord's Day Alliance talks about the significance of 9/11 and how this presents a new opportunity for the Christian Sunday. That's not really my point, and that's not the most significant thing about the letter. When you download this PDF, look at the bottom. On the letterhead itself, along the bottom, it says, serving the world and the churches since 1888. That's what it says right there. We didn't type that in. That was on their letterhead. This is significant, folks. This is really the key to understanding that statement that we're looking at phrase by phrase. But I want you to understand, Mrs. White understood this whole idea that it's a development, it's a process over time, it's not a single point in time. And what was happening with the Blair Bill was simply the manifestation of this development, but it was very significant. And she saw it, and she said it's the fulfillment of prophecy. What we've said was coming is here. And then it shouldn't surprise us that the Roman armies retreated, right? But I have a question for you. When the pagan Roman armies retreated back there around Jerusalem, had they decided they were just going to forget about Jerusalem? No. No, they came back. And make no mistake about it, the modern day counterpart, this alliance, still has every intention. I can hear the rumble of the return of the Roman armies. Can you? We've had plenty of evidence for it, right? Dies Domini, official statements from the papacy. All right, let's finish this out. Would then be a warning to us to leave the large cities. Now, this is important because there's a step-by-step progression. Leave the large cities preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for secluded homes in isolated places. Okay, we'll look at that in a minute. By the way, I mentioned this, but let me just remind you, in Jerusalem, they left Jerusalem for a smaller city. There's a step-by-step progression. By the way, there's a reason for that, and we're going to get into it in our last session today. But let's take a look at this. Leave the large cities. Now notice this. This is that statement I told you about from 1900. Get out of the large cities as fast as possible. Does it sound to you like Mrs. White thought the sign had come? She said the first step to take when you see the sign is to leave the large cities. Get out of the large cities as fast as possible. Here's a couple other statements. From the Lake Union Herald, April 7, 1909. Let it be your study to select and make your homes as far from Sodom and Gomorrah as you can. Keep out of the large cities. If possible, make your home in the quiet retirement of the country. Now, a pastor actually shared this quote with me one day to explain why he was still in the city. Because he said, it says if possible, and for me it's not possible right now. But he missed the whole point. What was clear is get out of the large cities. And then she goes on to say, if possible, get even further than that. Did you catch the meaning? If possible, get out of the small ones too and go to a quiet retirement of the country. Very interesting. Okay, here's another one. Human wisdom has urged the advantage of remaining in Battle Creek when the Lord has said, go, make plants in various places near to but outside the large cities. From Publishing Ministry 186. Another one. I've received much instruction regarding the location of sanitariums. They should be a few miles distant from the large cities. Selected Messages, Volume 2, 291. Okay, finally this last phrase, preparatory to leaving the smaller ones for retired homes and secluded places among the mountains. I'm going to have more to say about the rationale for this step progression in our next presentation, so I'm not going to say too much here. So let's summarize what we've seen. First of all, Mrs. White drew the parallel between the siege around Jerusalem and the sign to leave the cities at the end. Her description of the events surrounding the Sunday Law movement of the late 1800s was almost word for word identical to her description of the first siege around Jerusalem, and we looked at that. So this is just a review. Number two, inspiration makes clear that the assumption of power was already being witnessed in Ellen White's own day. Inspiration further states that the decree enforcing the papal Sabbath had already gone forth in a limited degree. Remember, we read that statement? A reminder of the first assault by Rome on the city of Jerusalem, which was limited to merely a siege of the city. Number four, Mrs. White herself likened the warning in her own day to the warning sign which was given to the disciples in Jerusalem, as well as the warning message sent to Lot in Sodom. Number five, following the Sunday Law developments of the late 1800s, the prophet explicitly stated that the time has come with reference to the need to get out of the cities. Furthermore, she specifically pointed to the Sunday Law developments as the reason to do so. And six, following the Sunday Law developments of the late 1800s, Mrs. White gave explicit counsel to leave the large cities, the first step we were instructed to take when the sign should appear. We need to remember something, and that is, it's Jesus that's calling you to get out of the city. And he told us something in his word. Well, it's in an epistle written by one of his apostles. Faithful is he who has called you, who also will do it. I want to encourage you tonight. God has a place for you. He has a plan for you to get out. And it's time. I've done my best this evening to try to build this layer by layer so that we really have kind of a more systematic approach. I want you to understand it. I wanted you to understand the framework, the setting. That's why we started with an overview of end-time events. And now we focused in on this issue. But I don't want to stop there, because there is a very important question, and that is, what about city evangelism? And we've got to address that question. I don't think it's fair to talk about this without talking about that. So we're going to do that in our next session. But I also want to say this. Years ago, there was an interest in getting out of Battle Creek. And Mrs. White wrote a letter of caution, telling people they needed to move wisely and systematically. And this has become more and more of a burden on my heart to help people develop a strategic approach to get out. I believe it's essential that you follow a strategic, systematic approach. The Apostle Paul said, let all things be done decently in order, and that goes for this too. I've been involved in this country living thing for more than 12 years now. It's been a great blessing. We've traveled around the country. We've traveled to other countries sharing this message. And I've had the opportunity to see people not follow a strategic approach and fail miserably. And it's not a light matter. For some people, it becomes a crisis of their faith. And Mrs. White warned that would happen. She said some people, they made precipitous moves, they didn't plan wisely and work strategically, they would cause a crisis for their whole family and cause people to blame God for the whole thing. I've seen people lose large sums of money and investment because they moved unwisely. And I don't believe God is calling us to do that. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to be going through some steps, a strategic approach that I think is critical. But I also want to say this, because some of you may not be able to be here tomorrow morning. And whether or not you're able to be here tomorrow morning, I'm only going to be able to drill down so far into this while I'm here, and there is more that I want to share with you, and here's how I can do that. If you'll write down this website, countrylivinguniversity.com. Right now, I have a free video series that we're actually producing. We're editing. We're in the editing stages of it, but the first video is up. The next video is going to go up on Monday, and that's where I'm really going to drill down deeper into this strategic approach. And this is a free video series. So really, we're putting it out there for you. countrylivinguniversity.com/video-series. Okay, video series with a dash in between the two words. Video-series. countrylivinguniversity.com/video-series. If you put your name and your email, you'll see me, yours truly, there on top of a mountain over our property. The place we live right now. We're actually, this is kind of interesting to you, we recently sold, I think it'd be interesting to you, maybe not, but we recently sold our country property. Did you know that? Yeah, sound crazy? We had an opportunity to get completely out of debt. We had a mortgage on that property. And I got to say, I never knew how good that would feel. We're currently renting a place in the country, and you'll see that place in these videos, on 10 acres up in North Idaho, beautiful setting. We're looking for another place, and I'm telling you all this because I want to encourage you. We're starting over. We've been doing this for more than a decade, but we're starting over. I've had people, someone came and asked me a few minutes ago, is it too late? And I told her no. I've had people tell me it's too late. My friend, it's not too late. And Dave and Laura and Allison are starting over. You can start too.